No two topics are so often written of but love and war. Bringing you a classic style JBAD video today because we're going to focus on the second of those options. Writing war is fun, but it's also very difficult. Wars are the complex, industrialized efforts of two people groups to destroy one another or at least take something from one another. And given how competitive and deceptive one might be in a simple game of chess, when it's brought out to a large scale in which the stakes quite literally could not be higher, there are going to be a lot of moving pieces. Given the massive expanse that writing about large-scale human conflicts can cover, we're going to be talking very broadly and in terms of perspective primarily. I could attempt to discuss the fine details of how war might differ in nature between an antiquity-like setting, a medieval, a Renaissance, an early modern, or contemporary sort of warfare. But not only am I not a historian, but I also do not intend for this video to be 37 hours long. Thus, I want to discuss the portrayal of war in media from 4 perspectives that you might use: the lowly grunt, the commander, the king, and the historian. These are 4 archetypes that you can use to flavor your perspectives. You can reflavor those however you see as well, squire, knight, president, antiquarian, or whatever, but the way that these archetypes exist will remain the same, because nothing other than perspective so thoroughly informs how it is that we hear about stories of war. The testimony of a line infantryman from the 54 Massachusetts, the perspective of a daimyo fighting under Tokugawa Ieyasu in the Battle of Sekigahara. You might get personal letters from Queen Catherine of Aragon to her husband Henry VIII following her defeat of the Scots. And then, of course, you have things that are more contemporary, like Eric Christensen's retelling of the Northern Crusades. These are all valid ways the history of conflict can be told, and they're all useful to you as a writer looking to convey this to an audience. We'll start at that on-the-ground perspective, however. When it comes to fiction, especially in the genre of fantasy where I tend to dwell more often, this is a perspective that can be forgotten. Often such stories represent kings and queens and princes and princesses, the shakers and movers of a society. Especially given that the construction of a fantasy world often exists for the purpose of conveying some larger scale tale or conflict, it would be pretty surprising for the only perspective given in such a world to be from a completely conventional person. But that's, of course, why it's very interesting when it does happen, when the farm boy remains a farm boy for the duration of their story. The Way of Kings, being one of 2 Sanderson novels I've ever read, has this with a character named Sen at the beginning. While the novel itself didn't turn out to be particularly for me, this section towards the beginning where we get the perspective of a fresh recruit in a massive army right before a battle was really interesting. And I think he did it quite well. It stuck out to me because it was not the type of thing I expected to see in this epic fantasy tale. And it being unexpected is actually one of the things that make this perspective really important. Of course, you obviously can write stories that are solely this perspective, which might be interesting in a purely fantasy world for the very reason I said, because fantasy stories tend to only be about the big people. But I would say this perspective can also do a lot for a story that is mostly focused on those sorts of characters. Because, of course, it's reasonable that most stories, especially those in these kinds of speculative fiction worlds, focus on those making the big moves. Just follow me here for a second. Star Wars was about Luke Skywalker originally, and as we saw it through the original trilogy, it was pretty good. But then Andor came around, and in giving us the perspective of someone who served the rebel cause from the beginning, doing the grimy work, stealing those singular prototype ships, and working to liberate small towns on but one planet in a galaxy full of oppression, we got something that, in my opinion, stands on its own and shows us something we never could have seen from that original story. In essence, what I'm saying is that if you have a story in which the perspective of the little people is not present, but would be really interesting if it was, it might be worth adding in just at least a chapter from some random normal individual who is part of a massive event. Only then will the actual scale of that event and of your story be felt. Only when we see through the eyes of someone who doesn't know your hero, who wouldn't recognize them if they saw them, or who would even be starstruck to meet your hero, who has concerns about their family at home, whether this job in the military will help them make ends meet, who fears what's to come and doesn't care so much for the theories and the ideologies behind their fight, but instead about the things they fear losing if they don't fight for whatever it is their army represents. Only with those sorts of characters do we really get to understand the fundamental truth about war that basically every war story ever tells us, over and over ad verbatim, and will continue to tell us, is that war, even justified, necessary wars, should you believe those exist, are a horrible thing. Even those men who stormed the beaches of Normandy feared, even they suffered, and even they probably wished it many times that they were anywhere else doing anything else, no matter how justified their cause was, even though their cause was very justified. When it comes to actually writing these kinds of accounts, it may be unsurprising to say that one of the best ways to learn how to do this is actually reading first-hand accounts of people who've been in these kinds of scenarios. Given that we as humanity have had quite a number of wars, there are quite a number of sources you can pull from. We have memoirs that date all the way back to the Roman times as well, so pretty much any level of technology or setting you want is out there from some first-person perspective if you're willing to put the time into actually looking for that source. And then, of course, reading it. There are some other things that I also think are worth emphasizing in your writing if you're going to write from this perspective, whether primarily or just as an addition, as suggested earlier. The first of those is to keep your perspective of your character in mind. I'm going to say that word a billion times in this video, but it does bear repeating. While the specifics of what you might do in terms of what happens to a character like this might vary, the important thing that might not be immediately obvious is the effect of the fog of war. Especially if you've done a lot of work putting together a fictional conflict for your character to take part in, there might be a temptation to tip your hand too much and spend a lot of time talking about the intricate specifics of everything that's going on as far as movements in the war are concerned. But realistically, if the protagonist is just another cog in the machine, so to speak, they not only aren't going to know these things, but it's in the vested interest of both their enemies and their commanders for them to know as little as necessary beyond what's directly relevant to their situation. News of big events would certainly be conveyed to them. Soviet soldiers in World War II would have known about D-Day, but they wouldn't have known any details really, and the powers that be were probably more likely to emphasize the contributions of other Soviet troops. So they'd probably know more about victories in Kursk, for example, than at the Battle of the Bulge. Even regarding the victories at Kursk, they'd probably only know there were a lot of tanks and we won. Then, of course, there's the propaganda aspect. And this I really want to emphasize as the core of what you can do that is interesting with a Grunt-type character. They are the most vulnerable to and primary recipients of military propaganda. Say you have Private Joe fighting for the country of Randomia. If the capital city, Playston, has recently been besieged by the forces of evil bad guy Ia, and things aren't actually looking so hot, Private Joe is not going to know that in all likelihood. His authorities are going to tell him that there's a battle going on, a minor skirmish, really, in the outskirts of the capital city, if they say anything about it at all. However, gossip spreads, especially in these conditions, and Private Joe might suddenly find out that what his authorities are telling him do not, in fact, line up with what seems to be reality. The inverse can be just as possible and also just as interesting. Sometimes the gossip that spreads might make things out to be worse than they are or better than they are. I mean, as Sun Tzu once said, and as a lot of what I'm saying here revolves around, all warfare is based on deception. If you want any singular factor to make your fictional conflict feel real from the perspective of a foot soldier, it should be that every piece of information they think they know about the conflict should almost constantly be in question. This carries over to our second perspective, which we can talk about now, the commander. Sometimes you want to write from the perspective of someone who's in between, in charge of some, commanded by others, aware of many more things, yet still blind and deceived in their view of the overall picture. Prince Andrei Bolkonsky of War and Peace might be an example of a character in this sort of position. In reality, the perspective difference between this and the previous isn't huge, though, as said, everything an officer will know is going to generally be a little more extensive and accurate than what the grunt knows, even if what is extensive and accurately given to them turns out to be only extensive and not so accurate. What is different, however, and probably the most unique thing about this perspective, is that this is the first level in which your character is able to send other people into combat alongside them and issue orders. They are responsible for the lives of others. While the number of people to which they're able to affect that too is a lot smaller than a king-type character, the difference is in how personal this relationship can be. Captain Miller from Saving Private Ryan is a great example of someone who explores this concept a bit. One of the core struggles of the story told is that Miller knows he's risking the lives of a dozen or more men just to retrieve one guy who may not be in particular danger anyway or may already be dead. There's a reason Private Ryan is the last surviving son of his family, and if he dies, his parents will have lost all of their children to the war, but it's still a difficult sell in one's mind. Especially since an officer character is going to be building up relationships with the people that fight under them, every time the officer sends them to do something dangerous, they're doing it with the knowledge that someone they know may die because of an order they gave them. How they reconcile that in their mind varies widely and is one of the most interesting things about these kinds of characters. The second thing that makes commander characters unique is that they are at a level where they are, by their specific actions, making a difference towards the outcome of a battle pretty much every time they participate. Your grunt level soldier can turn out to be a major badass or something and turn the tide of battle by sheer combat prowess, but with an officer, especially since raw power fantasy might actually feature a bit less with this archetype than with the grunt, the conflict comes in that the officer can control some things about how the battle turns out, but explicitly cannot control everything most of the time. The grunt is not surprised if their commander screws up and the battle goes badly, because the grunt was never in a position to make the decisions that might have prevented that screw-up. The officer, meanwhile, does have the capability to effect change, but maybe not enough to make up for the mistakes and failures of their peers, and the particular frustration of either them doing everything right and being let down by their comrades, or alternatively themselves being the weak link, and either of those is subject for real drama. This also ties in even further depending on your setting. If your commander character is in a sort of modern-esque structured industrialized military, this following point probably won't apply quite as much, but especially if you're working in a feudal or feudal-like setting, the officer is also likely a player in politics. In the wars of old, some lower officers were common-born soldiers elevated due to their skill, but the mid to higher level commanders were all nobles. And as one might know from reading examples of these kinds of characters, these nobles have complex ties to the rest of the people they're serving around, and also aren't always, or even often, granted their position on a meritocratic basis. Adding the feudal dynastic element to this kind of character makes everything a lot more messy, and messy is often interesting. They may have personal rivalries with their fellows, they may have friends or even relatives on the other side of the conflict. They might be jockeying with the other lower level officers for the emperor's favor or any other such thing. As said before, war is essentially every other human conflict with the mortal peril turned up to 11. So otherwise conventional or mundane interpersonal conflicts can quickly become deadly, even lead to betrayals or friendly fire incidents. All that potential is there. The only reason American school children know the name Benedict Arnold is because the idea of somebody betraying the cause of the American Revolution is so emotionally gripping. And when you finally get to the king or queen level of perspective, you fully moved from the boots on the ground to the social dynamics aspect of war. However, given that the king or queen, or alternatively the major hero perspective of war is the most common, it also has an insane amount of variance. Paul Atreides and Luke Skywalker share this category and use it in ways that could not be more different. But one thing all typically have in common is a degree of detachment. If you recall back to my comparison of Andor and the original Star Wars trilogy, the original trilogy's story is detached from Andor's, because while Andor's does eventually come to affect the original trilogy through it ultimately culminating in Leia having the Death Star plans at the beginning of A New Hope, That itself is the only obvious notable effect that Andor's story has on the larger narrative. It's a major impact when you actually think about how much had to happen for that simple fact of Leia having the Death Star plans. But of course, when you sat down and watched A New Hope for the first time, you weren't thinking about the incredible amount of work that went into getting it nearly as much. Because Andor obviously didn't exist as a concept yet, of course, but also because by introducing us to characters so high up in the food chain, we're disconnected from the nitty-gritty of the conflict. The gap is bridged when your king or queen character might sally out to go on the battlefield themselves when they slum it with the common soldiers for a time. But even then, the perspective difference is irreconcilable. If Abe Lincoln took to the trenches of Antietam, there's no way he would be treated as just another soldier. Because it's Abe Lincoln, President of the United States. If Abe Lincoln, President of the United States, is shot at Antietam instead of being assassinated by a sore loser after the war was over, things would have gone differently, and in all likelihood worse, because you can't afford to get Abe Lincoln shot at Antietam. This is the fundamental concern when it comes to these kinds of characters' involvement in war stories. Every time they participate in it directly, that is, fighting the battle themselves with their own two hands, they are deciding that the risk of organizational failure that had come with their death is worth what they can bring to the table. And this is typically where we get our two types of characters in the king category. The Hrothgar and the Beowulf, to take some examples from classic literature. The Hrothgar, named for the king of the Danes and Beowulf, is the one you see in more grounded examples, and is the reason you probably thought my Abe Lincoln at Antietam example was silly. Because, yes, Abe Lincoln was a pretty tough dude, he wrestled and all that, but he wasn't superhuman. And as history unfortunately proved to us, he had a pretty significant vulnerability to bullets, as I think most of us do. Thus, obviously, there's no particular advantage to putting him on a battlefield. The same is to be said of our titular example Hrothgar, who, while considered a wise and mighty king, is nowhere near as juiced as Beowulf. But then you take characters like Luke Skywalker, or really anyone important in Warhammer 40k, and they are always so souped up that not putting them on the battlefield probably would be a waste, and you get the Beowulf variant. Only Luke Skywalker was capable of facing Vader. A lot of the reason characters are built this way is because it's often more narratively satisfying. We want our Beowulf characters so they can slay Grendel personally in single combat with his bare hands, naked. Maybe not that part. You can have both, of course, and this scale is certainly a spectrum. Paul Atreides is essentially right in the middle, both the commander and strategic mind behind the Fremen Rebellion, but also the duelist who's able to kill Feyd-Rautha. However, it's worth noting that while you can do both in concept, your character cannot be doing both at the same time. If your Beogar or Hrothwulf or whatever is embroiled in combat, they aren't going to be doing all that much commanding. They can't be at the planning table and in the trenches at the same time, and doing both means they're doing neither one at their fullest capability. Thus, it's worth considering to what degree their strategic brilliance is required if there are suitable people to do that job while they rip and tear, or, of course, vice versa. The greatest marksman in the world, who's also an incredible, brilliant strategist, is probably going to be put in a position of command more often than in the position of a sniper. There really isn't a wrong side of this spectrum to fall on as long as you consider these things and act with forethought. Both can be interesting in their extremes as well. A brilliant commanding mind who rules the kingdom and leads the battles from the back can actually be a lot of fun, because the story then becomes about their people management skills, getting the right characters into the right places at the right times, doing the right work, and their ability to adapt to the changing situation and make decisions based on potentially faulty intelligence. And of course, going full Beowulf works for characters as well, considering that I named the very archetype for one of the best known heroes of ancient myth. Between them all, however, is where we circle back to the beginning and the Grunt's perspective. While the necessity of this will vary greatly depending on the tone of your story, it can be worth, amongst your troll arm-ripping offing and your 4D chess sessions, to have your character consider the lower scale perspectives, or have those perspectives in vignettes as I've been describing, if only to help show the true scale of the conflict you're portraying. Because, of course, one of the other interesting things about war is that it's big. And if you don't show how big it is, you might be missing something that you could do with it. And this all comes to a close with the historian's perspective. Perhaps the war happened a century ago, or perhaps they're watching it live as it happens. But the historian, or if they're watching it live, the war journalist, is yet another invaluable role to consider. And we'll start with that live one first. Civil War, which came out last year, is maybe a 6 to a 7 out of 10 to me, but it is interesting in the sense that its characters are all war correspondents that follow the fictional and kind of poorly developed conflict all the way to the White House. Doing it this way, they share much with the Grunt in that they have essentially no influence over how events unfold, but their personal involvement also comes from a completely different place. They're in about as much danger as they literally follow soldiers into combat on multiple occasions, but for entirely different reasons. To find that truth that is so elusive through all the other perspectives and bring that truth to others. And that, whether doing the contemporary war journalist or historian angle, is always the thing that sets this fourth perspective apart. Their priority doesn't have as much to do with the outcome of the war, even if they do pick a favorite to win. It's instead mostly based on finding what's true and what is not true about the war, and that allows for some entirely different ways of writing these stories. Any of the other three archetypes are purposefully and very notably biased. They could be biased in any number of ways for any number of reasons, all with the potential to be interesting, but the historian's bias is purely towards truth, in the Platonic ideal of a historian anyway. You can actually have a lot of fun with a biased historian too, one who conveys the tale to the reader with blatant lies and exaggerations, and you offer yourself the unique challenge of doing that while still make it discernible that your historian is lying. Because if your story is a historian's retelling of a fictional conflict, there is no other reality for your audience to compare it to and thus discern the truth against. So the trick in writing like that would become tipping your hand as an author that your narrator isn't quite being truthful, without also just making it read like obvious propaganda. Or maybe you could just write it that way too. That's the great thing about writing. You can kind of do whatever you want if you do it well. Regardless of what direction you choose to pursue with that, the advantage of the historian, particularly the one working well after the fact, is that they have access to a slew of extra information, which often includes the very perspectives of the characters we've been talking about before. They might have primary sources from the grunts, the officers, and the kings and queens, and how they choose to interpret these sources is where your narrator really has a time to shine. In my own writing project, the novels are presented as collections of primary sources put together by a historian a century and a half after the fact. While most things are presented without comment, occasionally the historian comes to chime in about some detail or another, offering hints towards what the world looks like after the main story the audience is actually reading about has already concluded. And while I've generally been referring to the historian working long after the fact as an advantage, it can also be a disadvantage. Not, of course, in the quality of the writing, but in the difficulty of that character's job. The sources that they're working with might allude to places or people that no other records exist of. Sacred treasures and superweapons may be used and detailed, and yet their providence is unspoken of and no traces of them remain anymore. Some of their sources may be incomplete, leaving large gaps in the lives of important figures where they come out the other end of that void changed. But evidence of what it is that affected them so has disappeared from history. All of these are things you can play with by sifting information through the sands of time. Writing warfare is essentially infinitely complicated, as is writing anything else that so thoroughly details the mass movements and actions of large numbers of people. But we'll probably be writing about them forevermore for the simple reason that they are interesting and they are dramatic. I have no idea to what degree this video was useful, but if you enjoyed it, I am glad. So that's the video, brought back a certified JBat classic format with our modern improvements to the channel style. Let me know what you guys think and if you're still interested in this type of content. Probably won't come around all the time, as I want to make sure I only bombard you with potentially worthwhile information, but I'm still game, of course. And if you're new and this sounds like a place you want to hang around, we have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want that, where we post all our videos early as we can. As we close out, I'd like to thank our patrons: Shadowrunner, Sani, Isaac Parrott, Raymond, Don, Sadako, and Cavalier of the Knights of the Inner Circle, Vion, Jodion Void, and Razor the Arcader, our knights, and Greer, TOW, and Craig, our loyal squires. And remember, war is the truest form of divination.